we'll see if we can talk about the fat lady today. You've heard that phrase, right? It's not over until the fat lady sings. It's not over until we talk about Salinger's fat lady. I was talking to a professor friend yesterday, and she was like, "Oh, so what are your students reading?" I said, "Oh, they're reading Franny and Zooey." And I said, "Yeah, we didn't get through it. Let's see. Can you, like, if you had to sum up Franny and Zooey in like one sentence, what would you say?" And so I wrote this down because this was good. She looks at me and she says, "Look, Paul, girls just want one thing." And I was like, "To have fun?" And she's like, "No, total ego death."
That's true.
Or at least girls in J.D. Salinger novels only want one thing, and that is total ego death. I mean, I just love the setup of it. That's it. Girls want one thing, total ego death. There it is, Franny and Zooey in a sentence. All right, that's what she's trying to do. There's a phrase, oh gosh, I don't think I have a working marker, but has anybody heard this phrase? The secret to life is to die before you die. Has anyone heard that phrase? It's sort of like it's almost like this sort of popular writer, Eckhart Tolle, said it. But that's sort of the point of if I had to sort of sum up all the way the pilgrim stuff and the thing that Franny is after, is that your life is basically just like if you were walking, talking ego like Lane or like all of us, you take a lot of blows, right? You take a lot of bruises, and you you get embarrassed and you hurt other people and you get hurt, you get wounded, and then you get resentful and all this stuff. And how do you get out of that cycle of like suffering? And the world doesn't seem to recognize that I'm special, and so therefore the world hurts me every time it doesn't recognize my specialness. And there's two ways of doing it. Either like make the world, like reorganize the world so that they recognize how special I am. And that's where you get like sort of a Hitler or somebody like that who's going to like reshape the world so that they're on top and usually push a lot of other people down while doing it. That's like the ego doing that. The other way to do it is not reshape the world so that my ego gets the attention it deserves. What's the other way of doing it?
To exterminate the concept of specialness.
Yeah. Yeah, get rid of that idea that I'm special. And that's dying before you die. So that's sort of the trick of the spiritual life.
We are the war, resistance is futile.
So
It's
the
not
Soviets
quite-
versus the Nazis.
Well, the Soviet thing again is more of like the on the political scale. Remember the Solzhenitsyn thing where he says the lie of every revolution in history is they think that the line runs between parties or classes.
That's why
And
it's got to just be the board. Collective.
Yeah, resistance is futile. Assimilate. No, but the spiritual technologies are trying to say, no, the line runs in every human heart, and then by saying the Jesus prayer, or your mantra, or doing your, like, whatever thing you're going to do, you're restricting the ego, and then it doesn't hurt so bad when you go to, out in the world and people, like, don't recognize that you're special. And then you don't become like a pathological, school shooter or something when the world doesn't see that, like, if you don't get the attention that you want, you got to get that attention somehow, even if you're going to like make a big point and hurt people while you're doing it. And that's a really extreme example, but I think in a lot of ways, a lot of the pain that people have, the pain that people bear, comes from this like ingrained assumption that we are important and we are special and we need to be seen. And if you can just sort of like put that in perspective and say, no, I'm not. And your life is better if you can die before you die a little bit. That's the idea. Girls just want one thing, total death of the ego. All right, let's think about this. Zooey is at pains to say that this is not a religious story, though, although there's like this religious component at the heart of it. He says it's a love story. And, yes, so moving on from that, and we got to get into what he means by love story. What we learn on page 65. So if you've got your book, I don't know, did you bring your books back today? I didn't really tell you. Yeah, so this would be page 61 or something. we learn that Franny and Zooey are freaks. That's their word. We learn that Franny's existential crisis is the result of an experiment undertaken by the two eldest Glass brothers, Buddy and Seymour, on the youngest of the two, Franny and Zooey. And so what is this experiment? Well, here it is. In my page 65, it's like a big long paragraph that begins the age differences in the family. But she says,
this is 56.
56.
Oh my gosh. What the heck?
Where it says the age differences in the family always seem to add unnecessarily.
Yeah, good. And this is part of the letter that Zooey is reading in the bathtub. And it's going to be about, the letter's from Buddy, about how, this experiment that they undertook on Franny and Zooey. And so what's the experiment? It's an experiment in education. Do you ever feel like your Sloka education makes you like a little bit of a freak? Because you care about things that like other people don't sometimes care about, and you feel a little bit freakish. Like it's going to be that, but really, exponential here. So he says, Seymour had already begun to believe, and I agreed with him, that education by any name would smell as sweet and maybe much sweeter if it didn't begin with the quest for knowledge at all, but with the quest, as Zen would put it, for no knowledge. Dr. Suzuki, D.T. Suzuki, says somewhere, like he's a Buddhist popularizer from the 60s, says somewhere that to be in a state of pure consciousness, Satori, is to be with God before he said, let there be light. So think that's the first words of Genesis, right? God said, let there be light, and there was light. But like before that, that's pure consciousness. Whatever happens before that word is spoken. And he says, Seymour and I thought it might be good to hold the light of knowledge back from you and Franny for a while. And then she said, in many of the lower, she says, so you are both able to conceive of a state of being where the mind knows the source of all light, all knowledge. We thought it would be wonderfully constructive to tell you as much as we knew about the men, the saints, the arhats, the bodhisattvas, who knew something or everything about this state of being. That is, we wanted you to know who and what Jesus and Gautama Buddha and Lao Tse and Shankar, I don't know that one, and Sri Ramakrishna, etc., said before you knew too much about Homer or Shakespeare or Blake or Whitman, let alone George Washington and his cherry tree, or the definition of a peninsula, or how to parse a sentence and spot a misplaced modifier. That was the big idea. Along with this, I suppose what I'm trying to say is that I know how bitterly you resent the years when Seymour and I were regularly conducting home seminars, and the metaphysical sittings in particular. I just hope one day, when we're both blind drunk, we can talk about it. Okay, so Buddy has orchestrated an education for Franny and Zooey. Now, just as you come to Sloka and you read Homer and Shakespeare and Chaucer, and it makes you a little bit weird because you care about like wisdom, and then you're like a little confused when you meet other people who don't seem to care about wisdom. And you're like, what about this? Before teaching them Homer, Shakespeare, and Chaucer, what do Buddy and Seymour try to teach them? They try to teach them to be in contact with nothingness, with being itself, with all these like sort of advanced Zen lessons and the prayer stuff from the Way of the Pilgrim. And they've got them reading all 4 volumes of the Philokalia before they've even read, Catcher in the Rye. And it's made them into freaks because they've essentially put their education upside down. Let's put it this way. If you teach somebody like super advanced philosophy before they know how to be a human being, they're going to be both a really bad philosopher and a really bad human being. Nice. Right? Like you have to learn how to be a human being first, and Seymour and Buddy did it the opposite way around. They were giving them the Way of the Pilgrim and teaching them to die before they die. They were teaching them to deconstruct their egos before they had an ego. Right? Like you guys are 16, 17. Like this is not for you. Right? You need to be building an ego. You need to be building a self. You need to be figuring out what you're good at, what you're special at. And yeah, you need to keep that ego in check so you don't, just demand things of people and hurt people and then get hurt yourself and the world doesn't recognize how special you are. You need a little bit of this, dying to yourself. But not before you've learned how to love the chicken soup and your mother, right? He's so mean to his mother. He calls his mother fatty, right? He's like just yelling at her to get out of the bathroom and Now, that's why their education has made them freaks, is that they've done it the backwards. Seymour and Buddy decided this would be fun to experiment on our 13-year-old, younger siblings. Seymour and Buddy go off to college and they read all this they read the Philokalia, they read all this advanced spiritual stuff, and then they give it to their 13-year-old brothers and sisters. And there is sort of a natural progression in the spiritual life, right? First you have to build a self, then you deconstruct it, and they're screwed up because Buddy and Seymour have inverted this, and it's backfired. And so look at how Zooey describes himself. This is on page 138, and I feel like I can resonate with this for sure. For me, this is 138. It's a long paragraph, so for you it's probably 132 or something. It begins with, "It's us," Zooey repeated, overriding her. Where he's going to say that we're freaks. What is it? 118. Okay, I'm leaping ahead of you. The pages. So bottom of 118. "It's us," Zooey repeated, overriding her. "We're freaks. That's all. Those two bastards," that's Buddy and Seymour, "got us nice and early and made us into freaks with freakish standards." Go down a little further. He says, "We don't converse, we expound. At least I do. The minute I'm in a room with somebody who has the usual number of ears, I either turn into a goddamn seer or a human hat pin, the prince of bores." And then he gives an example of when he goes out for a drink with this guy. And so he's like, look, they made us into freaks because we have these freakishly high standards for what truth and beauty and goodness are, because Seymour and Buddy got to us and gave us Jesus and Buddha before we knew how to thank our mother for the chicken soup that she's giving us. We're freaks, and so he said, whenever I go to a party, I either I don't converse with, I don't talk to them about how their lives are. I expound, and I'm telling them, trying to tell them all this wisdom, and I turn into a seer, which is just phony because I'm not, or a human hat pin. He says at one point, he says, "Always a heavy," is what he calls himself. Always a heavy. He's the one who's bringing the party down when people are trying to enjoy their goddamn consecrated chicken sandwich, and he's just going on about truth and beauty and goodness, and it's you walk into a party and you're talking to somebody and you're like, "So what do you do?" And usually that's a loaded question, because when people ask, "What do you do?" usually what they're asking is how much respect and deference do I need to pay to you? But do you do something important? But if the person says, "I'm a philosopher," then you're like, "Oh, that's cool." Right? And you don't want to be with the heavy. If they say, "I'm a poet," then you're like, "Oh, okay, you're probably more fun." You probably love things a little bit more. But that's what they were doing. He says, the minute I'm in a room with anybody, I'm either a seer and I'm just expounding and in the lecture hall, or I turn into a human hat pin and I just pick and prick away at everything that they do, and I'm always a heavy, and I'm the prince of bores, and they ruined me. I can't have normal friendships. I'm a freak because my standards are so high. And it's is that the fault of the world? This is what the novel is trying to ask you, right? Is it the fault of the world that people care more about who won the football game last night than they do about these eternal truths? Or is it the fault of these people who get so lost in the eternal truths that they forget how to care about being a human being? They forget how to care about the ordinary things like the chicken soup and who won the football game and what Lane is going on about. Right? The right response to Lane is not to just prick him like a human hat pin and deflate his ego. It's to see that well, why is he putting out all this ego? It's because he's insecure, right? And Lane needs to be loved. And Lane is never going to get better by you preaching at him, right? Lane is going to get better when you sort of understand what his wounded ego is after, and you're not flattering him and just oh, that's so interesting, Lane, but you're able to engage with him about the real. So that's what they say when they're freaks, and they're always a heavy. Mrs. Glass, the mother, says, neither you, at one point, she's got some of the best lines. She says, "Neither you nor Buddy know how to talk to people you don't like. You don't know how to talk to people you don't love." In some ways, that's the ultimate test, right? Is that there's all these, phony, fake people out here who are shallow, TikTok level kind of thinkers and feelers or whatever, but you're not better than them just because you've read all these advanced books because you went to Sloka, right? You have to use that to re-engage them and to talk to people that you don't like and ask and draw them out, right? So that's what the whole goal of the spiritual life is to die. When you die before you die, then you don't think that you're better than them anymore. You can see them and love them. So it's like your Sloka education, right? In some ways, I think this is what's interesting about it, and what's cool about classical education, is that you guys are handed all these books that you cannot yet meaningfully like internalize and process, right? There's no way that like when you're 13 and you're reading Shakespeare that you're going to sort of be able, but the ideas are over your head, and that's okay. Sometimes you get things in life out of order, or like something happens in your life, you lose a parent too young or something. Like you can't internalize that, you can't process that. You're not always going to be ready for the things that life throws at you, whether they're books or ideas. And sometimes life is not linear, right? You circle back to them, and you come back to that Wallace Stevens poem years later, or and you're like, well, I read that when I was 14 and whoosh, but I read it again at 25, and okay. Or this thing happened to me when I was younger, and I wasn't ready for it, but now I can kind of see it. And so it's important to see that Franny is not just having like a nervous breakdown; she's having a crisis of meaning in her life. And we learn, let's see, we learn about this psychiatrist on so look on 107, which for you would probably be in the 90s or 80s even. There's a paragraph that's for me, it's the bottom of 107. Where he says, all right, I'm very serious now. It's probably in the 90s for you. All right, I'm very serious now. This is the response. See if you can find it.
It's page 92.
92. When Bessie says, well, Franny's just home on the couch petting the cat, and she won't go back to college, and she won't write her Cannery Row paper, and she is dealing with all this stuff, and she won't do the simple things that she needs to do to get through the world. She won't even eat lunch. And Bessie says, I'll take her to a psychoanalyst. And Seymour says, look, listen, if you think of Seymour, right? The older brother Seymour kills himself after going to see a psychoanalyst. And we learn much later, that Seymour is really a World War II casualty. He was at the Battle of Normandy, and Seymour's crisis was different. He's just terribly scarred by the war, and but he says, but think of Seymour, and then go ahead and call some ignorant psychoanalyst and put her on meds. You just do that. You just call in some analyst who's experienced in adjusting people to the joys of television and Life magazine every Wednesday, and European travel, and the H-bomb, and presidential elections, and the front page of the Times, and the responsibilities of the Westport and Oyster Bay Parent-Teacher Association, and God knows what else is gloriously normal. If you do that, I swear to God, Franny will be in a nut board, or she'll be wandering off in the desert with a goddamn burning cross in her hands. So she says, don't take Franny. Look, if your choice is between being a freak and being well-adjusted, he's like, I'll take being a freak. Because ask yourself what you're being adjusted to. Like, look around you, right? Like, what passes for normal life is just like all of this, barely veiled despair that we're trying to sort of get past. And it's just everyone's like, oh yeah, this is normal that like we eat this food that's like poisoning the earth, and it's totally normal that like we have got relations with our brothers and sisters who are all like equally deserving of love, and they're all have rights in the image of God, but we keep order with nuclear weapons and the threat of destruction. And even the good guys, right? We were the good guys in World War II. Even the good guys are like dropping bombs on civilian populations and firebombing Dresden and things like that. And you're like, is that what do you want to be adjusted to that? Better, I'll be a freak, Zooey says, over that. I'll be the guy who reads Homer and Shakespeare and Chaucer and says like, look, the world as it is kind of sucks. Let's talk about the world as it should be, even if I have to be like a social outcast and a guy at a party who is always the heavy, the human hat pin. So that's, he sets up that Zooey feels like there's a false choice here. Because I feel like for you guys, you don't want to be freaks and you don't want to be well-adjusted, right? I think, well, I don't know. I don't want to speak for you. Maybe you do want to be well-adjusted, but ask yourself, right? Well-adjusted to what? What have you adjusted yourself to? Martin Luther King is very good about this. He says, there are things in life that we ought not to adjust ourselves to, right? Maybe the presence of industrial agriculture and what it does to the earth. Maybe the systemic racism that pervades our society. Don't become adjusted to that, right? Maybe the presence of nuclear weapons in our world. Don't become well adjusted to that. But don't be a freak either. You got to learn how to be human, right? I think that's the whole thing with Franny and Zooey. And they can't be human because they are, on this great spiritual path. And so Franny's either going to be a nut ward or she's going to be carrying a burning cross through the desert. And he's like, we got to find some other way to do this. And so the solution is going to be the fat lady. That's the dilemma, right? The dilemma this book is asking is saying, look, it's no good to be a freak where you reject the world out of hate because it's shallow. It's no good to be normal where you embrace the world out of ignorance. Is there a way to embrace the world out of love? And that's the challenge the book keeps setting before us. And Franny, I guess it's maybe embodied in the professor, Professor Tupper. I really feel for this guy. The world is full of Professor Tuppers, right? He's trying his best. There's a great description I won't read on 127 where he's nice and he's a charming smile and he's a good teacher and stuff. The problem is that he knows it, right? That he knows that he's like this charming Oxfordish, guy who's full of knowledge that he's disseminating to his eager students. And the ego, Franny says, like, look, even if you're good at your job like this guy, that's just another trap because the ego can turn anything, no matter how good, into a way of propping itself up. And that's antithetical to what the academic life is supposed to be about. The academic life is supposed to be getting yourself out of the way and pursuing truth. But you get really good at that, and then you realize that. So Franny says it's different when, we get that athletes are going to be egotistical, like ego serves them, it's good in that sense. But when a scholar is egotistical, she's like, hates it. And now Zooey ends up saying this. Do you ever have those times where you say, no matter what Zooey says, Franny always ends up crying afterward, right? Has that ever happened to you where you give somebody advice, and it might be good advice, but it's like, this is not the right time or the right place, and so he tries to do this. But the advice that Zooey gives her is this. He says, look, it's fine to hate ego. It's fine to hate the pursuit of, turning the pursuit of knowledge, which is supposed to be pure, into something impure, the pursuit of self, as Professor Tupper does. But don't hate Professor Tupper. Okay? That's, I think, the crux of Zooey's advice here before he gets on the phone and impersonates Buddy. The crux of Zooey's advice is sort of like hate the sin but love the sinner a little bit. It's like hate the false pursuit of ego that sort of infuses all the good, even the good things that we do, but you gotta love Professor Tupper, right? Even though you see all this bad stuff shining out in him. Do you see the difference, right? That Franny is busy hating the false, rejecting the false, hating the ego, but if that doesn't help you sort of embrace the person and want their liberation from that, then it doesn't do you any good. And she just is hung up on the way he goes into the bathroom before class, or she thinks he does, and like musses up his hair so that he looks like a little bit more bohemian when he's like giving his lectures about the Jesus prayer. And Franny says she's got these freakishly high standards. So this is, for me, this is page 147. She's going to talk again about being a freak. And Zooey says to her, this is when he's giving her good advice, but it's making her cry. And he says, as a matter, the bottom of 147 for me, it's a big long paragraph, and when he says, what do you think you're doing with Jesus' prayer? And he says, as a matter of fact, I can see no difference at all between a man who's greedy for material treasure, or even intellectual treasure, like Professor Tupper, and the man who's greedy for spiritual treasure. As you say, treasure is treasure, goddammit. So the ego can turn even the pursuit of like egolessness into a way of saying like, I'm better than Professor Tupper, right? So treasure is treasure, whether it's spiritual treasure or not. So that's what Zooey tells her, essentially, that she's using the Jesus prayer not to join herself to God, but because she thinks that she's separate, better than other people, is the problem. And the most important insight that Jesus has is that there is no separation from God, right? So that's, what page is that on? For me, so look at this passage. This is 169 for me.
What did the other passage start with?
The other what? Treasure's treasure, God damn it.
There's a part, 143 has the, if you're going to say the Jesus prayer, at least say to Jesus and not the same.
Oh, that's where I want to be.
Yeah,
so look at that.
143.
Okay, so look at what page 143. Yeah, if you're going to say the Jesus prayer, at least say it to Jesus, not to St. Francis or Seymour or Heidi's grandfather all wrapped up in one. And so she's like, what does that even mean? Say it to Jesus. And remember, this is not a religious story, right? This is a love story. But he's got to navigate this. What she's doing, she's using the prayer to become a less loving person rather than using it to become a more loving person. And that's the problem with it. That, remember, doesn't at one point he says religion is a punishment that God has for those who accuse him of creating an ugly world, right?
Oh, yeah.
If you think the world is ugly and bad, then God punishes you by, like, giving you a religion where but he says, no, it's the love of beauty, right? The philokalia. That's love of other people. That's the heart of it. So 169, he says, who is Jesus? He's only the most, verse of 143 for you guys.
Yeah.
He's only the most intelligent man in the Bible. That's who. Who isn't he head and shoulders over, etc. Go down to a few sentences. He says, don't tell me about Moses. Moses is a nice man and all, but he kept in beautiful touch with God and all that. But that's exactly the problem. He had to keep in touch with God. Moses did, with the burning bush and all that. Jesus realized that there is no separation from God. And then go down below. He says, most of everything else, who in the Bible besides Jesus really knew that they were carrying the kingdom of heaven around with them inside, where we're all too goddamn stupid and sentimental and unimaginative to look. The prayer of the aim of the Jesus prayer, the one and only aim of it, is to endow the person who says it with Christ consciousness, which means realizing that there isn't anything that separates you. That most religious people think, oh man, we're so separate, like we have to use these prayers to get back. He's like, no. The real aim is to realize there is no separation. That's the point of Jesus, right?
Do we need the Jesus prayer anymore?
Yeah, I think he thinks there's a right use of it. Because the ego does need to die before you can realize this. But then the last step you have to do is to realize that you're really pursuing this. You're really pursuing religion because you're trying to store up spiritual treasure, and that's no better than the person who's trying to store up like wealth or intellectual treasure or whatever. And then you sort of realize that the kingdom of heaven is already here, right? It's inside all of us. That it's not about who knows it and who doesn't. It's not about who's in and who's out, right? It's just about realizing that there is no out, right? There is no outside of this. And Professor Tupper is included in it. And so are all the mean, snotty little lanes of the world. And to see them and embrace them is the point of the Jesus prayer. But using the Jesus prayer to draw lines and say, this is who's in and who's out, that's what's bad. So the kingdom of heaven is within all of us, meaning that anybody can sort of become a manifestation of it to you. And even Bessie's chicken soup can become a manifestation of it to you. So this is 194 for me. This is a couple pages before the end. So whatever that is for you, probably in the 160s.
Yeah, 160s.
And he says, I'll tell you one thing, Franny. Do you see that paragraph? I'll tell you one thing, Franny, one thing I know, and don't get upset.
Yeah, it's on 165.
165. Ooh, it's close. I'll tell you one thing, Franny, one thing I know, and don't get upset. Oh, sorry, by the way, this is, he's on the phone at this point. And the phone, this is interesting, right? That phone line is an internal phone line for the Glasses apartment. And Zooey is on the phone calling Franny, but he's impersonating Buddy. He's pretending that he's Buddy, calling from upstate New York. But it's not Buddy's phone, it's Seymour's phone. So that gives Salinger a way of saying, look, it's already inside of you, what you need to know. And two, it gives him, Buddy and Seymour and Zooey all speaking as one voice, which is really interesting. So the phone becomes the symbol of that. And then he's saying on the phone, I'll tell you one thing, Franny, one thing I know, and don't get upset. It isn't anything bad, but if it's the religious life you want, you ought to know right now that you're missing out on every single goddamn religious action that's going on in this house. You don't even have the sense to drink when someone brings you a cup of consecrated chicken soup, which is the only kind of chicken soup Bessie ever brings anybody in this madhouse. So how are you going to recognize a holy person if you see one, if you don't even know a cup of consecrated chicken soup when it's right in front of you? So he says you're missing out on all the religious stuff that's happening, which is the ordinary stuff, which is the love of a mother giving soup to her daughter, which is the ordinary human warmth of things, because you're trying to look at all this transcendent stuff. And the problem is that Franny thinks she's going to become holier by fasting and refraining from what the world offers her, and when in fact, the whole point of Jesus is to understand that we become holy by feasting, right? By taking inside us this love that manifests itself in ordinary acts and embracing the family members and the grace that's offered us through them. And so that's really the point of the book, and it culminates in this metaphor of the fat lady, right? So on 196 or so, Franny, remember, has given up acting because she doesn't think it's glorifying to God. She's like thrown away all her acting scripts, like my friend threw away his CDs. And she's given it up. But before she gave it up, she was in a play. She was really good in the play. And Buddy, she doesn't respect anybody in the audience. That's why she gave it up. She's like, I was such a good, actor in this play, and they were all just in it for laughs, the audience, and they didn't appreciate the art of it. And Zoe says, did you know that Buddy and I went to that play? We snuck in as soon as it was dark. We sat in the back. We never told you. We watched you. We were in the audience. And so it's almost like you never really know who's going to be in the audience. Maybe somebody that you respect. Maybe the person that you're like, Professor Tupper or Lane, that you're sort of picking at, might actually be, a manifestation of Christ to you. So Christ is the fat lady. So he says, remember they're all on this radio show, right, called It's a Wise Child. And when you're on the radio, it doesn't matter what you wear, right? And they are on the radio, and the studio audience, they hate the studio audience, Zoe does, and he says they're all just a bunch of ignorant people who are just here to be entertained, and they're a studio audience. And what's more, I'm under a table, so nobody can even see my shoes. Seymour comes to him before the radio program and says, Zoe, you got to shine your shoes. He says, why? We're on the radio. And with these stupid yahoos yucking it up in the front of the audience, they're not going to even see my shoes. It's dark. Why should I shine my shoes? And Seymour says, shine your shoes for the fat lady. All right, so then this takes us to the last page of the novel. And who is the fat lady? He's saying, this. I guess look at this. This is the last page, right? He's saying, I don't care where the actor acts, or the second to last page. It can be on the radio, over television, whatever. It just, do it the best that you can. He says, I'll tell you a terrible secret. Are you listening to me? There isn't anyone out there who isn't Seymour's fat lady. That includes your Professor Tupper buddy and all his goddamn cousins by the dozens and all the Lanes and all the phony people. There isn't anyone who isn't Seymour's fat lady. Don't you know this yet? And you want to know that goddamn secret? And yeah, listen to me now. Don't you know who the fat lady really is? Ah, buddy, it's Christ himself. Christ himself, buddy. So this is the idea, is that whoever's in front of you, no matter how, annoying and egotistical and pathetic they are, shine your shoes for them, right? Do your best. Even if you're teaching to a bunch of just, ignorant people who aren't paying attention to you, which is not the case. But even if you were, you would still get up here and you'd still try to teach. And you'd still try to bring something, true. And you'd still shine your shoes. And it's not about them, right? Just don't treat them as if they were morons, right? Because everybody is potentially Christ to you, and that's the secret of the spiritual life. And then it ends when Franny falls asleep. The last thing is, but she seemed to know when to stop listening. She hangs up the phone, or puts down the phone, she just hears the dial tone. As if all of what little or much wisdom in the world were suddenly hers. When she'd replaced the phone, she seemed to know what to do next. She cleared away the smoking things, drew back the cotton bedspread. For some minutes, she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. She lay quiet, dreaming at the ceiling. As I read it, there are two possible ways to interpret this ending. Number one, Franny has abandoned the Jesus prayer and decided to seek holiness in ordinary things. Food, family, romance, knowledge, In other words, she's figured out that love has called her to the things of this world. A second possibility is that she's internalized the Jesus prayer. It's finally stuck into her heart. It's finally brought her peace and enlightenment. And here she is now at rest. Either way, whether she's abandoned the prayer or has fully internalized its meaning, it doesn't actually matter. The point is the same. In order to fall in love with the world, first you have to act like you're in love with the world. First you have to shine your shoes, because you never know who's watching. That's Franny and Zooey. See you guys Monday. We'll talk about James Baldwin.